Hey guys, welcome to Digit.in, and today we've got with us the Samsung Galaxy M31. Now, this is the newest smartphone from Samsung in its M series, and typically the M series has been all about the display, the battery and the camera. So keeping that in mind, we've been shooting with the M31 to see exactly how much better it is than its predecessors and whether on its own it's able to deliver on the promise of what Samsung has set it out to. So before we begin the analysis of the images themselves, let's quickly just go over the specs of the camera on the Galaxy M31. You've got a 64 megapixel primary camera with an aperture of f1.8. You've got a secondary 5 megapixel macro camera. You've got an 8 megapixel ultra wide camera and an additional depth sensor. So that's 4 cameras on the back. On the front, you have a 32 megapixel primary camera which is also able to shoot in ultra wide mode and also offer you a cropped perspective in case you need it. The 32 megapixel sensor, by the way, is capable of binning the image if need be, so we've got that as well. Now, shooting with the M31, there are a few things that stand out right from the very beginning. One, the focusing system on the M31's primary rear camera is actually very impressive, as it's able to lock focus not just on subjects that are far away but also those that are close. So if you like shooting detailed shots of, let's say, your food or people or small objects, this camera should be able to focus. You may think that you could switch to the macro mode and do the same thing there, but what we noticed was when you're shooting in the macro mode, let's say if you want to shoot something like this in the macro mode, you will have challenges with getting the distance right because the macro lens has no autofocus. So you have to physically move the smartphone forward and backwards in order to nail the focus. And sometimes what that may result in is you actually accidentally hitting the subject. So it's useful in some scenarios but not all. But what is good is that the focusing works not just in good light but also in relatively poor light. Of course, in pitch darkness, it's not going to work, but in situations like these where I was out walking in a mall the other day at night and it was able to focus just fine. Also, for my test shot, we have this bookcase that we shoot in good lighting conditions and in all near pitch dark conditions, and the M31 was able to lock focus again. So in terms of focus, I'm not very worried. Now, talking about the image quality itself, it's obvious that the binned image from the 64 megapixel sensor is far superior to the native 64 megapixel output. Case in point being these two images which were shot keeping the same subject in focus and not moving the frame at all. In the 64 megapixel image, we see that the subject is well lit, the detail retention is very good, the image is pretty sharp. But where we see some loss is in the background when it comes to the dynamic range. The highlights in the skies are completely clipped and you really cannot see anything beyond the leaves here. But then if you see the 12 megapixel image, the background completely changes and everything is now visible very clearly. This could be due to several factors. It could be because maybe the smartphone's hardware is not fast enough to apply the HDR algorithm to a 64 megapixel image, or it could just be that binning a 64 megapixel image into 12 is resulting in a lot more information that can be represented in the image. So it's one of those two scenarios, but the bottom line really remains that shooting in 12 megapixel will give you far higher dynamic range. Like, I'm not even kidding, just look at the differences between this and this, it's a lot. So shoot in 12, you're better off, especially if you're going to be working in low light. In terms of the detail retention and sharpness, it's surprisingly good. Now, walking around a camera museum, in fact, in Gurgaon, it was very surprising that even indoors, the M31 was able to take nice, sharp images of objects that were in fact kept not just behind glass, but also had very weird and problematic lighting. So overall, like, shooting with this has been a pretty reliable experience. I did not have any instance where I felt that, oh, I have to take out my other more expensive smartphone to take photos because this was not being able to cut it. That was never the case, which leads me to actually be very surprised and very impressed with what Samsung has done with a phone of this caliber. Now, in low light, yes, you do not have any detail retention. Everything when you zoom into a picture looks smudged, but what you do get is that if you're using night mode, the image will appear brighter. So there is more dynamic range being captured by the sensor and being put into the image, but that's pretty much it. In terms of the ultra wide lens, there is again no autofocus there, and you do have noticeable softness of the edges as seen in, let's say, a photo like this one, where if I zoom into the edges, you see everything starts to stretch out, especially over here in this corner and even in the bottom left corner over here. So, but this is thankfully not necessarily a problem with the camera itself, but generally how ultra wide lenses work. Even when you're shooting ultra wide on a DSLR, you tend to notice some softening on the edges, but it is not very pronounced, so that's good. The lack of autofocus, however, does make it very difficult to shoot good images, because if you've got a subject who is sitting close to the camera, for example, in this case, my dog, I was just not able to get the photo right. Like, the perspective was amazing and I wanted him to appear larger than life, but because the camera cannot focus on something that close, it just didn't end up being a usable image. So my dog is actually slightly out of focus. That being said, I mean, it really comes down to you and how you would want to frame your subjects, but the fact that there is an ultra wide camera is pretty impressive. For macro, unfortunately, I preferred using the primary camera to take close-up shots instead of the macro lens, because, for example, with this photo in particular, it was difficult to get the right frame, and also at the same time it was difficult to make sure the shot was crisp because there was a slight breeze which kept the flower moving. So if you ever shot macro, you know that not just you but the subject have to be absolutely still, because when you're so close to the subject, every minutest of the movement will throw the focus off. So it made using the macro lens a little difficult, so I just chose to stay with the primary lens. Also, quick tip, if you know that you're in balanced lighting conditions, for example, this shot right here, there is no strong light source or anything of that sort, I could have, and you consequently can, switch to the 64 megapixel mode and shoot this image, and then, you know, have the ability to sort of go really into the image if you wanted. So this is a 12 megapixel version, so not as detail rich. This is another 12 megapixel image that I shot, which I feel makes me want to eat more dessert. Impressive. Again, did not need any post-processing. Overall, the M31 has a fairly impressive rear camera stack. You've got that. And then on the front, the selfie camera too is pretty good, because it can take very nice photos, especially in daylight. But the problem is the beauty mode is on by default, and it sort of gives you that plastic skin effect. If you like that, great, good for you, but the first thing I would do is turn that off. So you can see the difference. This is the first photo I took with the selfie camera, and the skin just looks very pasty, and when I noticed that, I turned the beauty mode off, and now we can see the detail come back into the skin. So the texture of the human skin is actually very intricate, and if that's something you value, then, you know, turn it off. Otherwise you can always make yourself look like a plastic doll. The other noticeable thing was, especially when shooting in backlit conditions, the camera does tend to prioritize the face. If it sees a face in the frame, it will prioritize the exposure for the face, and therefore actually deliver pretty impressive results. So this is in the normal mode from the front-facing camera, and then this is in the wide mode from the front-facing camera. Both the photos were taken with the sun directly behind me, and in fact you can see the sun in the frame itself, yet the exposure is spot on, and the HDR algorithms are able to do a good job of retaining a lot of detail in not just my face but also in the objects surrounding me. So that's very impressive once again. But what was interesting is that when you click on the wide view, that's when you're using the full 32 megapixel sensor. That's where the entire sensor is being used, and when you actually click on the single icon, you get a more close-up view, which is actually a cropped view from 32 megapixel sensor. So that, all in all, shouldn't be a problem. That's something Samsung has done for a while. So just for reference sake, this is the normal and this is the wide angle selfie. Then taking some test shots with the M31 in controlled conditions. This is one of the scenes that we've often used. Has a lot of color, a lot of text and a lot of texture. In all four corners, there are specifics that we measure. So we have texture on the top right, we have text on the left, and in fact even text in the center, and a lot of colors all the way around the frame. So in good lighting conditions, the M31 of course was able to nail this perfectly. There is very little you could ask this camera to do more with regards to this photo. But when you turn the lights down, the results are completely different. One, we see an uneven distribution of illumination, which means that the HDR algorithm has to really work very hard to sort of retain the detail and bring out the information in this image, and it's not really able to do a very good job. We see the text on the labels get smudged, we see the texture on the book on the right completely get lost, and we also see slight shifts in colors of red and blue. So this is very normal for any imaging sensor when it's shooting in low light and has to boost the ISO as high as possible. So you will see a shift in color. Now, when you actually turn on night mode, things are slightly different. The frame is brighter, yes. The text is slightly sharper, yes, but you still have a loss in detail. So overall, like, you know where the strengths of the M31 lie and where it falters. When shooting in good light, you can actually just expect it to be a very reliable smartphone camera. No questions there, whether it's the rear camera or the front. When you go into low light situations, that's where you should know that the rear camera will of course be able to shoot the image, but it may not be properly illuminated in case you're shooting in extremely dark conditions, such as, you know, the inside of a pub or a dimly lit restaurant, things like that. But if you do turn on night mode, you could get some of that illumination back, but expecting any rich details to be present in these images would be asking for too much. So that's a quick review of the Samsung Galaxy M31's camera. I hope you've enjoyed this video, hope it's been informational. And in case you have any further questions about what we've talked about, feel free to leave them in the comments below and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So thank you guys for watching.